Greenwood, Mississippi, October 15, 1993. The morning shift bell at Delta Cotton Mill rang at exactly 6:30 a.m., just as it had for the past 47 years. Workers streamed through the chain-link gates, their breath visible in the crisp autumn air that carried the scent of cotton dust and diesel exhaust. Among them should have been Sarah Beth Montgomery, a 24-year-old quality inspector who hadn't missed a day of work in 18 months. Sarah Beth's burgundy Honda Civic sat in the employee parking lot, keys still dangling from the ignition, her thermos of coffee growing cold on the passenger seat. Her supervisor, Vernon Hayes, noticed her absence immediately. Sarah Beth was the kind of employee who arrived 15 minutes early and stayed late to finish reports. She was saving money for nursing school, working double shifts whenever possible, and had never called in sick without notice. The mill's security guard, James Crawford, remembered seeing her car when he'd made his 10 p.m. rounds the previous night. The lot had been nearly empty then, with only a few vehicles belonging to the overnight maintenance crew. Sarah Beth's car stood out because she always parked in the same spot, third row from the entrance, directly under the amber streetlight that cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt. By noon, when Sarah Beth still hadn't shown up or called, Vernon contacted her landlord, Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, who lived in the main house of the small duplex Sarah Beth rented on Magnolia Street. Mrs. Whitfield knocked on the door and called out, but received no answer. The apartment was locked, and Sarah Beth's bicycle was missing from the small covered porch where she always kept it chained. The Greenwood Police Department treated it as a routine missing person case initially. Officer Danny Morrison took the report, noting that Sarah Beth was a responsible young woman with no history of drug use, mental illness, or troubled relationships. She had moved to Greenwood from Jackson 3 years earlier, seeking a fresh start after her mother's death from cancer. She kept to herself mostly, attended First Baptist Church on Sundays, and sent money to her younger brother who was finishing high school in Jackson. As the afternoon wore on, a pattern began to emerge that troubled the investigating officers. Sarah Beth's bank account showed no recent activity. Her last purchase had been groceries at Piggly Wiggly on Monday evening, milk, bread, frozen dinners, and cat food for the stray tabby she'd been feeding. The store clerk, a teenager named Ashley, remembered her because Sarah Beth always paid with exact change and asked about Ashley's night classes at the community college. Detective Ray Crenshaw arrived at the mill parking lot just as the sun was setting, painting the Mississippi Delta sky in shades of orange and purple. The autumn air carried the smell of burning leaves from nearby neighborhoods, mixed with the industrial odors that defined this part of town. Sarah Beth's car appeared undisturbed. Doors locked, windows intact, nothing obviously missing. But something felt wrong to Detective Crenshaw, a 20-year veteran who trusted his instincts. The bicycle's disappearance puzzled everyone. Sarah Beth used it to commute the 2 miles between her apartment and the mill, rain or shine. She'd bought it second-hand from a classified ad in the Greenwood Commonwealth, a blue Schwinn with a white basket that she'd lined with plastic flowers. Neighbors often saw her pedaling down Magnolia Street in the early morning hours, her work uniform pressed and her long brown hair pulled back in a ponytail. As darkness fell over the Delta that October evening, Sarah Beth Montgomery had been missing for nearly 24 hours. Her disappearance seemed to defy explanation. A hard-working young woman who simply vanished between leaving work and starting her next shift. The mill's security cameras from 1993 were grainy and limited, showing only the main entrance and missing the employee parking area entirely. Detective Crenshaw stood beside Sarah Beth's abandoned Honda, studying the empty parking lot as cotton trucks rumbled past on Highway 82. The mill's floodlights created harsh circles of white light separated by deep shadows. Somewhere in this maze of industrial buildings, residential streets, and cotton fields that stretched to the horizon, a young woman had disappeared without a trace. Greenwood, Mississippi, October 16, 1993. The search for Sarah Beth Montgomery began at dawn on Saturday, October 16th, when Detective Crenshaw organized the first systematic effort to find her. "37 volunteers gathered at the mill parking lot, church members, co-workers, neighbors, and members of the local VFW post. The morning air was sharp and clear, with the kind of Delta autumn weather that makes everything seem possible. They divided into teams, each assigned a different sector of Greenwood's grid of streets. Sarah Beth's bicycle had become the primary focus, a blue Schwinn that someone, somewhere, must have seen. The volunteers walked slowly through neighborhoods, checking behind houses, in drainage ditches, and along the network of dirt roads that connected cotton fields to the main highways. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield proved to be Sarah Beth's most dedicated advocate. The 73-year-old widow had grown genuinely fond of her quiet tenant, often inviting her for Sunday dinner and holiday meals. Mrs. Whitfield spent her own money printing missing person flyers and drove her 1987 Buick to every business in 3 counties, asking managers to post Sarah Beth's photograph near their cash registers. The flyers showed Sarah Beth's work ID photo, a young woman with kind eyes and a reserved smile. Her brown hair pulled back in the neat style required by mill safety regulations. The description read, 24 years old, 5'4", 125 pounds, brown hair, brown eyes. Last seen wearing mill uniform, blue shirt, khaki pants and white tennis shoes, maybe with blue Schwinn bicycle. Vernon Hayes, Sarah Beth's supervisor, became increasingly troubled as days passed without any word. He knew her work habits better than anyone. How she arrived early to review quality reports, how she double-checked every measurement, how she'd volunteered for overtime during the busy harvest season. Vernon started each shift by glancing toward her empty workstation, half expecting to see her bent over a clipboard, making notes in her careful handwriting. The first week of searching yielded nothing but false leads and dead ends. A gas station attendant in Eta Bena thought he'd seen a woman matching Sarah Beth's description, but the timing was wrong. A farmer near Money found bicycle tracks in his field, but they belonged to local teenagers who often rode there. A trucker reported seeing a young woman hitchhiking on Highway 7, but when police followed up, they discovered it was a runaway from Clarksdale who had already returned home. Detective Crenshaw expanded the investigation beyond Greenwood's city limits, contacting sheriffs and departments in LaFlaurie, Carroll, and Sunflower counties. He spent long hours reviewing Sarah Beth's limited social connections, interviewing everyone who knew her even casually. The picture that emerged was of a woman who was almost invisible in her community, polite, hard-working, and largely friendless. Sarah Beth's younger brother, Michael, drove up from Jackson every weekend to join the search efforts. At 19, he was finishing his senior year of high school and working part-time at a tire shop to pay for college applications. Sarah Beth had been his primary support system since their mother's death, sending him $50 every month and calling every Sunday evening to check on his grades and his plans. Michael told Detective Crenshaw about their last phone conversation, which had taken place on Thursday evening, died October 14th. Sarah Beth had sounded tired but normal, asking about his chemistry test and reminding him to apply for financial aid. She'd mentioned that she was thinking about getting a second job to save money faster for nursing school. She'd always wanted to work in pediatric care, influenced by the kindness of the nurses who had cared for their mother during her final months. The local newspaper, the Greenwood Commonwealth, ran several stories about Sarah Beth's disappearance. But as October turned to November, public interest began to wane. The cotton harvest was in full swing, demanding long hours from mill workers and farmers alike. The volunteer search groups grew smaller each weekend, until finally only Mrs. Whitfield, Michael, and a few church members continued looking. Detective Crenshaw refused to give up, but he was realistic about the challenges they faced. In 1993, small-town police departments had limited resources for extended investigations, There was no cell phone data to track, no security cameras covering most of the town, no social media presence to analyze. Sarah Beth had lived a simple, analog life that left few digital traces. The most frustrating aspect was the complete absence of any evidence of struggle or foul play. Sarah Beth's apartment remained exactly as she'd left it, bed made, dishes washed, work clothes laid out for the next day. Her bank account was untouched, her mail accumulated in neat stacks, and her cat continued to appear each evening at the back porch, waiting for food that never came. By Thanksgiving 1993, the active search for Sarah Beth Montgomery had effectively ended. Her car was eventually moved from the mill parking lot to the police impound yard, where it sat among other unclaimed vehicles. The missing person report remained open, but Detective Crenshaw was reassigned to new cases that demanded immediate attention. Mrs. Whitfield continued to pay for newspaper ads on the anniversary of Sarah Beth's disappearance, always including the same message: Sarah Beth, if you're out there, please come home. If anyone knows anything, please call the Greenwood Police Department. But as months turned to years, even these acts of remembrance became less frequent. Greenwood, Mississippi. August 23, 2018. 25 years had passed since Sarah Beth Montgomery's disappearance when city workers arrived at the old Greenwood water treatment plant to begin its long overdue demolition. The facility had been abandoned since 2003, when the city opened a modern treatment center on the opposite side of town. For 15 years, the brick building had stood empty, its windows boarded up and its access road slowly being reclaimed by kudzu and Mississippi marsh grass. The demolition crew, led by foreman Tommy Hutchinson, had been hired to clear the site for a new municipal park. It was tedious work in the August heat, requiring them to check every room for hazardous materials before bringing in the heavy machinery. The building had been used for storage by various city departments over the years, and rooms were filled with abandoned office furniture, outdated equipment, and boxes of paperwork that should have been disposed of decades earlier. Tommy was working in what had once been the plant supervisor's office when he noticed something unusual about the metal filing cabinet pushed against the far wall. The cabinet was older than the others, with a different style of handles and a layer of rust that suggested it had been there much longer. When he tried to move it, he discovered that it wasn't just heavy. It had been deliberately secured to the wall with metal brackets and bolts. Using a crowbar, Tommy pried the cabinet away from the wall. Behind it, hidden in the narrow space between the cabinet and the concrete blocks, was a small cardboard box that had been wrapped in several layers of plastic trash bags. The plastic had protected the contents from moisture and insects, preserving whatever was inside in near-perfect condition. Tommy called his supervisor before opening the box, sensing that this wasn't ordinary construction debris. When they cut through the plastic bags, they found a collection of items that clearly didn't belong in a water treatment plant. A woman's wristwatch with a cracked crystal, several pieces of costume jewelry, a small leather wallet, and dozens of handwritten letters bound together with a rubber band. The wallet contained a Mississippi driver's license that made Tommy's hands shake as he read the name, Sarah Beth Montgomery, with an address on Magnolia Street in Greenwood. The license photo showed a young woman with brown hair and serious eyes, a face that Tommy recognized from the missing person flyers that had covered the town 25 years earlier. But it was the letters that proved most significant. They were love letters, written in careful cursive handwriting on pale blue stationery. Each letter was signed, "Forever yours, D." Dabatios and addressed to "My dearest Sarah Beth." The letters spoke of secret meetings, promised futures together, and frustration about having to hide their relationship. The tone grew increasingly possessive and desperate in the later letters, with the writer expressing anger about Sarah Beth's plans to leave Greenwood for nursing school. Tommy immediately contacted the Greenwood Police Department, which had been reorganized several times since 1993. Detective Maria Santos, who had joined the force in 2010, was assigned to examine the discovery. The current police chief, Robert Hill, had been a patrol officer during Sarah Beth's disappearance and remembered the case clearly. Detective Santos carefully catalogued each item in the box, photographing everything in place before removing it for analysis. The letters were particularly intriguing because they revealed a side of Sarah Beth's life that had never been documented during the original investigation. According to the correspondence, Sarah Beth had been involved in a romantic relationship that she felt compelled to keep secret. The letters mentioned specific locations around Greenwood where the couple had met privately: the old railroad bridge over the Yazoo River, a secluded spot near Greenwood Cemetery, and the abandoned water treatment plant itself. The writer described bringing picnic lunches to share with Sarah Beth during her work breaks and expressed frustration that she wouldn't introduce him to her friends or co-workers. Most revealing were the final 3 letters in the collection, dated in early October 1993, just days before Sarah Beth's disappearance. The tone had shifted dramatically from romantic to threatening. The writer accused Sarah Beth of leading him on and demanded that she abandon her plans to leave Greenwood. One letter included the ominous line, "If I can't have you, then no one can." "You belong here with me, and I'll make sure you never leave." Detective Santos cross-referenced the initials DW with the list of people who had been interviewed during the original investigation. She found several possible matches, but one name stood out, David Warren, who had worked as a maintenance supervisor at the water treatment plant from 1989 to 1995. Warren had been among the volunteers who participated in the early search efforts for Sarah Beth, but he had never mentioned knowing her personally. The discovery of the box had preserved more than just Sarah Beth's possessions. It had preserved biological evidence that hadn't been available to investigators in 1993. Several of the letters showed traces of saliva where the envelope flaps had been sealed, providing potential DNA evidence that could finally identify the writer. Detective Santos submitted the letters to the Mississippi State Crime Lab for analysis, requesting expedited processing given the age of the case. The lab was able to extract DNA profiles from multiple letters, creating a genetic fingerprint that could be compared against databases that hadn't existed when Sarah Beth first disappeared. As word of the discovery spread through Greenwood, long-buried memories began to surface. Several residents recalled seeing David Warren around town in the days following Sarah Beth's disappearance, despite his claim that he had been working out of town that week. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, now 98 years old and living in an assisted care facility, was shown a photograph of Warren and immediately recognized him. "That's the man who used to watch her," Mrs. Whitfield told Detective Santos, her memory still sharp despite her advanced age. He would drive past the house real slow, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day. Sarah Beth mentioned it once, said it made her uncomfortable, but she thought maybe he was just lost. The hidden box in the water treatment plant had preserved not just evidence, but the truth about Sarah Beth Montgomery's final days. After 25 years of silence, the building that had been David Warren's workplace had finally revealed its secrets. Greenwood, Mississippi, September 12, 2018. The DNA results came back on a Tuesday morning that changed everything. Detective Maria Santos thought she knew about the Sarah Beth Montgomery case. The genetic profile extracted from the letters matched David Warren with 99.7% certainty, but more importantly, it matched DNA evidence from a different case entirely, one that had been solved just 3 years earlier. In 2015, David Warren had been convicted of stalking and assault in Tupelo, Mississippi, where he'd moved after leaving Greenwood in 1995. During that arrest, his DNA had been entered into the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, creating the connection that had eluded investigators for decades. The computer algorithm that flagged the match had essentially solved a 25-year-old cold case with the click of a button. Detective Santos drove to the Mississippi State Penitentiary at Parchman, where David Warren was serving a 6-year sentence for his 2015 conviction. At 61, Warren had aged into a thin, grey-haired man who bore little resemblance to the robust maintenance worker who had volunteered for Sarah Beth's search efforts in 1993. When Detective Santos showed him the letters from the hidden box, Warren's composure cracked immediately. The interview took place in a small, windowless room with concrete walls painted institutional green. Warren sat with his hands folded on the metal table, staring at the evidence bags containing his own handwriting from a quarter-century earlier. Detective Santos noticed that his hands trembled slightly as he recognized each letter, each piece of jewelry, each item that connected him irrevocably to Sarah Beth's disappearance. "I never meant for it to happen the way it did," Warren said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I loved her, you know. I really loved her." The confession that followed came in fragments, interrupted by long silences and moments when Warren seemed to forget where he was. Detective Santos let him speak at his own pace, understanding that this was likely the first time he had told anyone the complete truth about October 15th, 1993. Warren had met Sarah Beth in early 1993 when she brought her bicycle to the water treatment plant during a rainstorm, seeking shelter until the weather cleared. He was immediately attracted to her quiet demeanor and began finding excuses to visit the mill during her shifts. He learned her schedule, her habits, her dreams of becoming a nurse. When she was polite but distant, he interpreted her behavior as shyness rather than discomfort. The letters had been his attempt to create a relationship that existed mainly in his imagination. He would slip them under her apartment door or leave them on her bicycle seat, always careful to avoid being seen. When Sarah Beth never responded, Warren convinced himself that she was simply too shy to express her feelings openly. The breaking point came when Warren overheard Sarah Beth telling a co-worker that she had been accepted into a nursing program in Jackson and planned to leave Greenwood after the holidays. The idea of losing her sent Warren into a spiral of desperation and rage that culminated in his decision to confront her directly. On the evening of October 14, 1993, Warren waited in the mill parking lot until Sarah Beth finished her shift. When she emerged at 11:30 p.m., he approached her car and demanded that she talk to him about their relationship. Sarah Beth tried to leave, but Warren grabbed her bicycle from the car's trunk and refused to give it back until she agreed to meet him the following evening. Sarah Beth arrived at the water treatment plant the next day because Warren had threatened to damage her bicycle if she didn't come. She had told no one about the meeting, hoping to retrieve her property and end Warren's harassment once and for all. But Warren had spent the day working himself into a frenzy, convinced that if he could just explain his feelings properly, Sarah Beth would understand that they belonged together. When Sarah Beth made it clear that she wanted nothing to do with him and intended to report his behavior to the police, Warren's fantasy collapsed into violence. He grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her and demanding that she listen to him. Sarah Beth tried to run, but Warren was stronger and faster. In his desperation to prevent her from leaving, he pushed her hard against the concrete wall of the plant. She hit her head, Warren said, his voice breaking as he relived the moment. There was blood, and she wasn't moving, and I knew I had to do something. I couldn't let anyone find her there. Warren carried Sarah Beth's body to a deep maintenance shaft beneath the plant, a space that had been sealed during renovations years later. He took her bicycle apart and disposed of the pieces in different locations around the county. Her personal belongings, the watch, the jewelry, the wallet, he couldn't bring himself to throw away. Instead, he hid them in the box behind the filing cabinet, along with the letters that had started everything. For 25 years, Warren had lived with the knowledge of what he had done. He left Greenwood in 1995, telling people he had found better work in North Mississippi. But the guilt followed him everywhere, manifesting in the stalking behavior that eventually led to his arrest in Tupelo. The pattern was always the same: fixation on women who reminded him of Sarah Beth, followed by increasingly aggressive attempts to force relationships that existed only in his mind. Detective Santos arranged for a search team to examine the sealed maintenance shaft at the demolished water treatment plant. On September 20, 2018, they recovered Sarah Beth Montgomery's remains, along with fragments of her work uniform and personal effects. After 25 years, she was finally going home. The arrest warrant for David Warren was issued that same day, charging him with first-degree murder in the death of Sarah Beth Montgomery. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, now confined to a wheelchair but still mentally sharp, was informed of the breakthrough by phone. She wept openly when Detective Santos told her that Sarah Beth had been found. "I always knew she wouldn't have just left without saying goodbye. Mrs. Whitfield said through her tears. "She wasn't that kind of girl. She would have told me if she was going somewhere." Michael Montgomery, now 44 and working as an engineer in Atlanta, returned to Mississippi for his sister's funeral. The service was held at First Baptist Church in Greenwood, the same church where Sarah Beth had attended services every Sunday morning. The sanctuary was filled with people who remembered her kindness, her work ethic, and her quiet dreams of helping others. David Warren was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During his sentencing hearing, he read a brief statement expressing remorse for his actions, but offered no explanation that could make sense of 25 years of silence. The judge noted that Warren's decision to participate in the initial search efforts, while knowing exactly what had happened to Sarah Beth, demonstrated a level of deception that bordered on the sociopathic. The old water treatment plant site was eventually converted into Sarah Beth Montgomery Memorial Park, as originally planned. A small bronze plaque near the entrance commemorates her life and reminds visitors that truth has a way of surfacing, even after decades of concealment. Detective Santos often visits the park during her lunch breaks, sitting on one of the benches and thinking about the young woman who simply wanted to finish her shift and go home to feed a stray cat. The case file has been officially closed, but the questions it raised about isolation, obsession, and the vulnerability of women who live alone continue to influence how the Greenwood Police Department investigates missing person cases. Sarah Beth Montgomery's story became a reminder that some secrets cannot stay buried forever, and that justice delayed is not always justice denied. In the end, it was science and persistence that brought her home, along with the chance discovery of a box hidden behind a filing cabinet in a building that should have been demolished decades earlier. The truth had been waiting there all along, preserved in plastic bags and faded blue stationery, waiting for someone to move the right piece of furniture and let the light in.